So there's a question that many people ask, and that is, if, as you say, the Dharma is so very difficult to achieve, then what hope is there for someone like me who is a layperson, who has worldly concerns? Now, this is both a good way of thinking and not such a good way of thinking. The reason why it's a good way of thinking is because it shows that that individual has an interest in the Dharma and wishes to accomplish and progress in their practice. But it's also not a very good way of thinking. And that's because, as Westerners, we do not have an endemic belief in past and future lives and karma cause and effect. And so in general, most people, when I speak to them, are thinking about this life alone and what they're able to achieve before it's too late. For example, if they're in their 40s, then they think they don't have much time left in this life to get enlightened. But this isn't the way that a Tibetan or somebody from the Indian subcontinent would think. Someone who has an endemic belief in past and future lives, then they know that they've already been born infinite amount of times. And not only that, but they will also have many future lives. And so basically for them, there is plenty of time. If we look at the story of the Buddha himself, then it is said to have taken 3 incalculable eons to become a fully enlightened being. The way it started was that the Buddha gave rise to the intention for enlightenment. At that time, the Buddha had very little merit. The Buddha was a beggar and encountered a great bodhisattva. And then coming to understand what it means to be a bodhisattva, the Buddha gave rise to the desire to become like that himself one day, and then worked tirelessly on the path for 3 incalculable eons. Sounds like a long time. But if you have a belief in infinite lifetimes, regardless of how long it takes, you will apply yourself on the path. The other thing we lack in the West is a sense of renunciation, because the inception for entering into the door of the Dharma is a belief that samsaric life, mundane life, is nothing but suffering. If you have such a belief, then it's 100% certain that you will apply yourself for future liberation, regardless of whether it happens in this lifetime or one many lifetimes from now. In fact, someone who believes in karma cause and effect and rebirth also knows that it is uncertain where one will be born the next time around. The important thing on the path is to apply oneself in the here and now to virtue and to avoid negativity. But leaving all that aside, let's get back to this issue of what it is we can do as lay practitioners on the path. Well, one of the most difficult things that people find to give up when they encounter the Dharma is their loved ones, and especially their partner. And so for most people, they find it almost unimaginable to think that they would be able to leave their loved one in order to live a spiritual life. Chime Rinpoche has often said that the Dharma should not become a cause for a couple to split up. In fact, it's not required of you to leave your partner in order to progress on the path. First thing we have to do is be very realistic about our own situation, and also be realistic about what we can achieve in the time that we have. We hear that being a Buddhist means to have generated renunciation, but renunciation is not something that you can fake. We have attachments, even to little things like food and clothing. So of course we are attached to the ones that we love. The important thing is to take it one step at a time. And in this way, we will progress closer and closer to final awakening. But it doesn't have to all be done in one lifetime, or even in many lifetimes. If I take my own life as an example, at one point I developed a very strong wish to practice the Dharma. I was frustrated and feeling that I was unable to make progress. I had a busy family life and also many responsibilities related to work. At some point, because of my living circumstances, I found that I was more or less free to practice the Dharma. But at that time, I was living with somebody who I loved very much. And I have to say, it was one of the most difficult decisions I had to make, to decide to go off into retreat, And I also believe it's not one that you should take lightly. Regardless, then in the end, I decided that it was more important for me to engage my practice. I felt in order to make significant transformation in this lifetime, I needed to go into retreat. But something you should understand is retreat is not for everyone. Many people make the choice to do a long retreat before they're ready, and then the results can be disastrous. There's no point in committing yourself to a 4-year cloister retreat if after the first few weeks you develop a strong revulsion for practice. It will only be counterproductive. The general advice is you shouldn't immediately think about doing long retreat or doing intensive practice. In fact, this is where most people go wrong. When they encounter the Buddha Dharma, the first thought that comes to mind is, what should I practice? What should I meditate on? But this is actually a mistaken way of thinking. Really, what we need to do first is our own research. You need to understand where your spiritual path leads, and whether or not that is in harmony with your stated aims and objectives. It's only once you've established your motivation and what your basic beliefs are, then one should seek a practice. That notwithstanding, then once you have decided to apply yourself to practice, then there are a few practical things that come to mind. For example, we all need to eat. We need somewhere to live, and we need clothing to put on our back. And there's no point in pretending that we are a yogi like Milarepa. We have to be realistic and practical about our arrangements. In my years meditating, that I've encountered many different types of practitioners trying to make their mundane lives and their spiritual lives work in harmony. It's actually quite difficult to do. A very common strategy is to try to split your spiritual and your mundane life in two, so that basically you work half the time and practice half the time. Now this sounds like quite a reasonable solution, but there are problems with this. And the main problem is, when we have a busy working life, then that tends to take away our spiritual way of thinking. Because we are wrapped up in material concerns, and also because of the influence of our co-workers, then it's very easy to be dragged back into mundane life. There's always something going on in city life to distract you. For example, a sporting event, or your workmates may ask you to go out for drinks. And these things severely infringe on your practice. And so really, if you're going to work half the time, let's say 4 hours a day, and then try to practice, you need to be extremely disciplined. And most people aren't. Most people are very easily influenced by their friends. In reality, then I've only met 2 people who have been able to make this strategy work. And aside from just finding the necessities in life, for example, money and food, then environment is also an important consideration. And so if you do wish to split your mundane life and your spiritual life in two, then my suggestion is you should look for somewhere to live that is conducive to the spiritual path. For example, find somewhere in the countryside, or try to work online rather than have to go into an office or work in the mundane world. For beginners, then environment is one of the most important considerations. This is why the masters of the past established hermitages in the mountains and forests. A quiet and scenic location far away from the hustle and bustle of busy life is ideal for practice. Of course, if you've already realized the sublime truth, then it makes no difference whether you are in a cave or in an office block. For most of us, we haven't achieved sufficient stability in our practice to be able to meditate in a busy city or otherwise where there are lots of distractions. In fact, the term monastery, which is gompa in Tibetan, means a place of isolation. And taking these points into consideration, then I am currently trying to build a hermitage in the Gulf Islands of British Columbia. And in terms of environment, then there are a few better places in North America. I mean, there are a lot of very isolated locations in the far north, etc., in Alaska and the Yukon. But there are many practical issues when it comes to trying to establish a hermitage in a place like that. Because of our dependence on the world and things like hospitals and shops, for example, then you need to be somewhere not too far from civilization, but at the same time achieve a sense of isolation, somewhere where your mind will not be distracted by worldly concerns. In terms of livelihood, then part of the reason why I chose this place is because there's a lot of natural resources. For example, there's a lot of trees in the area. In the end, what you need to do is make a balance between the amount of hours you spend just trying to survive and the amount of hours you're able to dedicate to your meditation. So whether or not my plan will work is uncertain, but the idea is that people who come here will be able to spend maybe 1 or 2 hours a day at most working, and the rest of the time they can dedicate to their meditation. But there's something you need to understand. I didn't build this place for my own benefit. In fact, if it was just for my sake, I would probably go live on a boat. And the reason why I'm trying to build this hermitage is because I'm acutely aware of the challenges and difficulties that Westerners have when they try to practice the Dharma. My feeling is, if I can establish a small community of like-minded people, and then use the resources that are here present on this land, we may be able to support each other in an authentic wish to practice the Dharma. In fact, it isn't easy at all to practice completely alone. It's the most difficult kind of meditation retreat. Also, you don't want too many people. And to my mind, this is where many Dharma teachers go wrong, because they think too big. Realistically, I think that all I can do is provide space for 5 or 6 dedicated practitioners to spend all of their time meditating for years and years. But to my mind, it is worth it, because if even 1 or 2 people come to understand the spiritual path, then they can teach that to others and have an influence in the future of Buddhism here in North America. Whatever is the case, don't feel that you're unable to accomplish the Dharma because you're a lay practitioner or because you have many responsibilities in life. The most important thing is to develop an aspiration for practice. And once that aspiration is instilled deeply within your being, what you'll find is that opportunities will naturally arise. Please bear this in mind. Whatever you can do to practice with a good motivation, to achieve final awakening for the sake of other sentient beings, in the end will bring benefit and contribute to your progress on the spiritual path. Well, that's about all I had to say this afternoon. So until next time, then see you later.